Welcome to this episode of 10 Minutes with Sam, and this is Akshat Singh. Our guest for today is Mr. Michael Kugelman. Mr. Michael Kugelman is an expert on South Asia, and he's currently at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where he serves as the Deputy Director for the Asia Program and as the Senior Fellow for South Asia. We're glad to have you on the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So the format of the show is fairly simple. We have 10 minutes, and in these 10 minutes, we'll try covering as much ground as possible. So without much further ado, let me get to the first question. Sir, you are a senior associate of South Asia at the Wilson Center. You're considered to be an expert on India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So let's begin with that. So we know that the US is in a hurry to withdraw its military from Afghanistan. How do you think that will impact the geostrategic situation of South Asia and particularly the Af-Pak region?
So I think the first question here is, do U.S. forces withdraw with a peace deal in place or without one in place? I think it's much more likely you're going to have a lot of problematic consequences if the U.S. leaves without a peace deal in place. And I think that's quite likely. I think it could take years to get a peace deal. And the U.S. government does not have that type of patience, and regardless of what administration is in power come January 2021. So I think what we expect is increased instability in Afghanistan, and that will clearly have some problematic spillover effects in bordering countries like Pakistan and Iran in terms of refugee flows, drug flows, that type of thing. That could be very problematic. I think we have to worry that Pakistan will intensify its support to the Taliban, an asset it's long seen as its main vehicle for access and influence in Afghanistan. And if Pakistan sees the country, Afghanistan, falling apart, I think that unfortunately Islamabad could intensify that support. Now, if there's a peace deal and the war ends in Afghanistan, then everything could be a lot different and there's more reason to be optimistic. You could look at the possibilities and potential for scaled up economic activity and infrastructure projects in which many countries around the region, China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, even India, could cooperate. But since it's so likely that U.S. forces will leave in the absence of a peace deal, I think we have to look at the strong possibility of scaled up instability, where you have countries around the region trying to do what they have to do to secure their interests. And that could be, unfortunately, quite problematic.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you mentioned was the increased role of Pakistan in funding the Taliban, which actually brings me to the next question. We know that in the current situation, the relationship between Taliban and the elected Ghani government, they're not very good. Both the parties do not recognize each other as legitimate. So do you think that the upcoming Intra-Afghanistan talks would be a farce given the relationship between these two parties?
Well, it's the big question. I mean, each side claims that it's committed to talks, and there have been a number of obstacles to beginning this intra-Afghan dialogue. They've generally been removed. But indeed, I think that at the end of the day, the Afghan government and the broader Afghan political class and the Taliban have completely different visions for what they want Afghanistan to look like if the war ends. And I think that's a big constraint right there. And there are other constraints as well. It's not just differences between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but differences within the Afghan government. You have these deep rivalries, as you know, among the top most powerful political figures in Afghanistan, like President Ghani and Abdullah, his main rival. And the fact that these two have clashed about how the peace process should take place and who should be represented on the government side and who should be overseeing those in managing the peace talks on the government side, that's problematic. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest constraint to getting an intra-Afghan dialogue to succeed is that the Taliban knows that U.S. forces are leaving the country. The Taliban knows it's just a matter of time. And I think the Taliban could conclude that it has a strong incentive to simply wait the U.S. out. It knows that when U.S. forces leave, it'll have a very significant battlefield advantage. It could simply give up on talks at that point, return to the battlefield, and try to overthrow the Afghan government by force and take over power. And I think you could argue that the Taliban may feel that it's better off trying to return to the fight and trying to seize total power by force, as opposed to sitting at a negotiating table and trying to negotiate some type of arrangement where it would have partial power through some type of political settlement. I mean, the Taliban has always rejected the Afghan state as it exists now, and it's always rejected the main political figures in play. So why, at the end of the day, would the Taliban want to share power within a system that is long rejected and with people that it has long rejected. So sorry for being so skeptical on this. I think indeed we need to have a peace process, but it's going to be very difficult to succeed.
I agree, especially at a position where Taliban knows that its military superiority would not be contended for after the US military withdraws. That makes perfect sense. But talking about the military, let's come back to Pakistan for a little. We know that the military has a very vital role to play in Pakistani politics. So when Prime Minister Imran Khan was elected, he was seen as an outsider. He was seen as someone who would bring in a new legacy of politics. And yet he has managed to somehow consolidate his position within the military ranks. We also know that while he has been very vocal about the atrocities on Muslims in Kashmir, he has maintained a somewhat selective silence on Uyghur Muslims in China. Do you think Imran Khan would be able to survive the turbulent politics of Pakistan?
Short answer is yes. I think Imran Khan is likely to become the first Pakistani prime minister to serve out his or her full term in a civilian-led administration. For context, I mean, Imran Khan is a fascinating figure. He launched his own political party in 1996. It was very stridently focused on anti-corruption, which has remained in place. That's remained a focus for more than 20 years. But this is someone who had been very critical of the Pakistani military for quite some time. He was very vocal when you had these protests that formed against military rule in Pakistan in 2007 and 2008, the so-called lawyers movement. Of course, things evolved, and as you well know, if you're a Pakistani politician and you aspire to the highest positions of power, you need to get the support and the buy-in from the army, and he clearly done that. So, but even before he took office as prime minister, in recent years, there was reason to believe that he would not necessarily be a favorite son of the armies, just because his personality is very strong, stubborn. He's not known for liking to defer to authority, and that's not what the army likes. And the army likes its prime ministers to be pliant and weak, quite frankly. And yet, what we've seen happen is that he has essentially deferred any sense of wanting to be in charge and that type of thing. He's been willing to defer. I think that's the key phrase. So that's helped his cause with the army. But bottom line is, as I noted before, he has the support of the military, and I think the military believes that despite his flaws, despite his inexperience, despite his struggles, he's their best bet because he agrees with them on most issues. And at the end of the day, who would replace him? And the military, given how difficult the situation is domestically in Pakistan with the economic crisis and trying to move on from the pandemic, the last thing it wants to do is to usher in a sense of political instability if Imran Khan is pressured to step down. So I think he's going to serve out his term.
Absolutely, and I mean, despite the fact that he has gained some sort of popular support domestically, we see that many of his actions in the international fora have backfired, particularly his actions with respect to Kashmir. The most striking event being that when there was the revocation of Article 370 in India, Imran Khan wasn't even able to gather support from Middle Eastern countries such as UAE and Saudi Arabia. Why do you think that happened?
Certainly, since August 5, 2019, when India revoked Kashmir's special autonomous status, there's been a stepped up effort on the part of the Imran Khan-led government to get the issue out there. And I actually think that there are some constituencies in Pakistan that feel he's been that he's been successful and at least being more vociferous than his predecessors had been. But at the end of the day, the reason that he struggled, the reason that the likes of the Saudi Arabias have not agreed to take Pakistan's side, geopolitics, real politics. Saudi Arabia values its relations with India. It sees key markets there. There's energy relationships to consider. India has actually sought to deepen its relationship with Saudi Arabia, as it's had to pull back in its relations with Iran due to U.S. sanctions on Iran, which has made India less willing to do energy business with Iran. So bottom line, the world sees India as an important country economically, geostrategically, and it's hesitant to get into this Kashmir issue because it knows that that's not what India wants.
Well, sir, that brings us to the end of 10 minutes. Once again, thank you so much for being in the show, and we would certainly talk to you again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.